The first points of the 21st Formula One weekend were up for grabs today at the 4.309-kilometer Autodromo Jose Carlos Pace in Brazil in the Sao Paulo Sprint race, as Ferrari tackled the 100-kilometer mini-race, aware that McLaren would be the clear favorite. The two British cars showed remarkable competitiveness yesterday during the sprint qualifying session. However, it was hoped that race pace would be a different story. Even though it is a short stint where drivers push almost the entire time, tire management was once again a crucial factor to consider, especially given the demanding Interlagos track surface. But tire wear wasn't the only element to take into account. First of all, there was the start, where anything could happen, even though the finish line is quite close to turn 1. Additionally, the Brazilian track offers clear overtaking opportunities with DRS zones and a long high-speed section. Ferrari aimed to attack immediately, as keeping the Constructors Championship dream alive means trying to limit the points lost against the two MCL38 cars this weekend. Now let's take a detailed look at how events unfolded for Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz in the Sao Paulo Sprint race at the Interlagos circuit. Charles Leclerc starts from third, right behind the two papaya-colored cars, while Carlos Sainz, behind Max Verstappen, was hoping to outpace the three-time Formula One world champion. The prancing horse has sought a setup that would favor race pace, partly sacrificing the single lap and thus the qualifying session. It will be interesting to see if this clear strategy pays off and brings the expected benefits. Mistakes are not allowed, as even minor errors would heavily impact the outcome in this first competitive scenario where points are awarded. Ferrari believed it could challenge McLaren, but to reach the set goal, they had to flawlessly execute the planned strategy. After the usual laps to test the cars with a certain amount of fuel on board, the F1 cars line up on the starting grid. Ferrari drivers climb into their SF24 single-seaters after the mechanics have carried out the usual checks on the cars: power unit, transmission, braking system, and transmission. Before starting, let's take a look at the weather and track conditions. Air temperature at 28.3 degrees Celsius, track temperature at 44.7 degrees Celsius, humidity at 50%, and wind at 1.8 kilometers per hour from the northeast. The two Ferrari SF24 cars fire up their engines. Just moments before the start, they proceed with the installation lap. The tires chosen by the Maranello team are yellow-banded Pirellis. During the formation lap, the Ferrari cars push hard, trying to heat the tires as much as possible. Activation is not as reactive as McLaren and Red Bull's. The clutch release is good for almost everyone, and nothing unusual happens at the start. In this initial phase, Max Verstappen is very aggressive and putting pressure on Charles Leclerc. Meanwhile, the two McLarens try to pull away, and Carlos Sainz attempts to stay close to Max Verstappen. On lap number 5, finally, the tires on the red car seem to start performing at their best. For this reason, the Monegasque shakes off the pressure from the Dutchman. His Ferrari race engineer Brian Bozzi asks to manage the compounds more in turn 7. Despite the few laps, the need to conserve the tires is apparent. Carlos Sainz is slower and unable to keep pace with the Red Bull driver, who, after 2 laps of stealth, now seems to be closing in on car number 16 again. In general, we can say that the handling of the SF24 car is good, but the pace is not sufficient to attack the McLarens. We are still witnessing a very competitive race because the pace at the front is quite similar. It would be important for Carlos Sainz to improve his lap times by a couple of tenths to get closer to the reigning world champion and put him under pressure. The Spaniard struggles especially in Sector 2, in turns 8, 9, and 10, where he loses the most time. We are talking about 5 cars within just over 5 seconds. On the radio, there is always talk of tires. They need to be managed because the race is still long. Charles Leclerc struggles in turn 1 just as he did in qualifying. On lap 13, he makes a mistake but manages it. Additionally, he is asked to perform lift and coast, but doing it comfortably with a Red Bull glued to his rear is practically impossible. Therefore, he does it in turn 6 and not on the starting line. Fortunately, the traction of the red car is really good and allows the Ferrari driver to gain a certain margin in acceleration for defense. However, this condition does not last long, as on lap 18, Max Verstappen overtakes him. Charles Leclerc is angry because lifting off before the corner costs him time. He then asks if he can stop lift and coast. Unfortunately, the answer is no, as the red car has to do it to manage the temperatures, which would otherwise exceed the safety threshold. It is a real shame because as long as the need to cool the tires was not urgent, Charles Leclerc was in the slipstream of the McLaren MCL cars. Therefore, Charles Leclerc lifts off and records a slower lap to allow the tires to breathe, while Carlos Sainz closes in. On lap 22, the virtual safety car comes into play, effectively putting an end to the race, as the cars only start pushing again when there's one lap left. In conclusion, we can say that the setup problems of the red car became evident in the Brazilian sprint race, as the imperfect aerodynamic mechanical compromise affected tire management. While the red car's pace was not bad at all, the imprecise aspects took them out of contention for the top positions. Charles Leclerc claims he pushed too hard at the start of the race, a factor that naturally did not help. Before the second qualifying session, there is time to modify the setup of the SF24 and try to improve the balance of the two Ferraris. McLaren therefore celebrates a 1-2 finish in the sprint race of the Brazilian GP. There were strong doubts in the paddock about whether the MCL38S could withstand the 24-lap distance with a low and rather extreme setup, yet the Papaya cars achieved the goal set by the Woking team. Lando Norris won the mini-race thanks to the position swap that Oscar Piastri, who started from pole position, granted him on lap 22. Lando Norris gains 2 championship points on Max Verstappen, reducing the gap to 45 points from the Dutchman, who managed to climb back to third place. Lando thanked the Australian for conceding him the victory, and the team led by Andrea Stella brought home the maximum possible result. Red Bull seems more comfortable in race pace than in single-lap pace. Max Verstappen was able to pass Charles Leclerc's Ferrari on lap 18 when the Monegasque experienced a noticeable tire drop as he started on a used set with 6 laps of wear compared to 3 for Norris and Verstappen. The Dutchman, who had complained about losing a lot of time behind the SF24, tried to close the gap to the McLarens until he got close to Oscar Piastri, who was in defense mode. Meanwhile, on lap 21, Nico Hülkenberg stopped with a smoking Haas. The German put the VF24 off the track, and initially, race control only waved yellow flags, later switching to a virtual safety car until the Haas was removed. The management of the virtual safety car was questionable, with Max complaining via radio that the McLarens had slowed down too much, not respecting the delta time. Verstappen, on the other hand, ended up under investigation because before the virtual safety car was lifted, he had closed in on Piastri to prepare for an attack that the Red Bull driver aborted. The stewards will have to verify whether the Dutchman exceeded the allowed speed or if the 2 cars ahead slowed down too much. Max risks a 5-second penalty, which would drop him behind Leclerc, costing him a championship point. The World Championship leader can be satisfied with the points achieved. The RB20 showed good pace in the race, confirmed by the other Red Bull, that of Sergio Perez, who climbed from 12th to 8th position and secured the fastest lap in 1.11.678, earning a point for the Constructors Championship.